Good morning and welcome to today's panel on digital transformation in the MENA region, harnessing internet accessibility for COVID-19 recovery. My name is Marissa Khurma and I'm the director of the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. This panel is part of our digital transformation series that aims to improve our understanding here in Washington of the landscape of digital economies in the region and really all things digital in across the MENA region, the challenges, the gaps, the opportunities, and the beacons of hope in the progress that we have been witnessing in many of the countries in the region. This series has featured conversations with ministers of information technology or the digital economy from Jordan, Egypt, and that we will also be hosting the Minister of ICT from Tunisia next week, but also publications, one of which is central to the discussion today and is co-authored by MEP Program Associate Alex Farley and our colleague from across the pond, Manuel Langendorf, who are with us here today to discuss the paper. So this publication zooms into internet accessibility across the MENA region amidst the COVID-19 pandemic and assesses the readiness of MENA countries to shift employment and education online. So I'm very pleased to be introducing today's panelists, starting with, of course, both Alex and Manuel. A little bit more about Manuel. In addition to being a co-author on this paper, he is an independent researcher and writer focused on digital transformation in the Middle East and North Africa. He has been working with GIZ on a number of projects and was a fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations. Nidmeen Al-Saadani, who is joining us today from Egypt, serves as Regional Vice President for the Middle East at the Internet Society. Nidmeen also served as Undersecretary for International Relations at Egypt's Ministry of Communications and Information Technology. And last but not least, Alice Bosley is the co-founder and executive director of 51 Labs, which is an Iraq-based international startup incubator that helps talented entrepreneurs in conflict-affected areas to launch their startups. Alex had also worked at the design lead at the Columbia Entrepreneurship Design Studio, teaching entrepreneurship programs and coaching startups in New York City. Thank you all for your time today. And without further ado, I turn it over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Marissa. Thank you for introducing the panel today and introducing the audience to the Digital Transformation Series. And welcome virtually to the Wilson Center. I'd like to also thank Nirmeen, Manuel, and Alice again for joining the panel. It's good to see you all again. Once more, my name is Alex Farley. I'm the program associate, and as mentioned, I'm co-author on a paper we drafted with Manuel on this subject. But just to set the scene a little bit, I'd like to say the COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, has brought many changes to the economy and to the MENA region and has done a lot of economic damage. GDP contracted over 3% according to the IMF in 2020. Employment for youth and women declined 10% and 8% respectively, also according to the IMF. But one of the interesting changes that it has brought is the way people use the internet. No doubt because of pandemic restrictions and lockdowns, 11% more people used the internet in 2021 than they did the year before. According to McKinsey, more shoppers in the UAE and Saudi Arabia used online shopping to buy essentials and will continue to do so in the coming years. And this is really what got us thinking, what role will the digital economy play in the economic recovery of the region from the pandemic? So as mentioned, we started this project last year. And I think some of the key findings we found in that paper was that increasing internet accessibility and affordability is the key dimension to driving a lot of that growth. But in order to achieve that, MENA needs serious investment in internet infrastructure to improve that affordability and access. The region also needs another key thing we found. It needs a lot of development to digital skills at all levels, including intermediate skills for workers, advanced skills, and basic skills for the general population, but also needs a lot of management know-how in order to drive the growth in the digital economy. So without further ado, we have convened this panel to help answer some of these questions. And so firstly, Manuel, I wanted to start with you. I know that when we were working together, you wrote very effectively on the digital divides facing the region. So if you could talk about the digital divide and why it is a serious barrier to that access issue, could you paint us a picture of the user environment for the internet in the Middle East region?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Marissa and Alex, for the kind introduction. It's great to be back with you again. So I think, as you mentioned, Alex, the pandemic has really highlighted how important it is to make internet access more inclusive when we think of the closure of borders, the closure of schools for many, many months. So that is the starting point when we think of these divides, I think. And also you mentioned the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and that is a good point to start with, to think about the region as not being a monolith when it comes to digital infrastructure and how many people are able to use the internet in each country. So the main division we have is, roughly speaking, between the GCC countries and the rest of the region that is lagging behind. And we have seen an increase in the number of people using the internet, which is definitely a positive sign. So at the moment, it stands at around 66% in Arab states. And when we look at youth, so people under 25, the number is even higher. Again, a positive trend. And also, we still have this continuing trend that people mostly use mobile phones or cell phones to use the internet. But while we have seen these positive trends on the increasing numbers of internet users, as you said, they're important divides that need to be tackled. And I just want to briefly highlight two of them. One is the gender divide and one is the urban-rural divide. So on the digital gender divide, so that means that women are less able to access the internet than men. I think we have bad news, but also somewhat good news. So on the bad news, this divide very much continues to exist, and there's still financial, skills-based, and also societal hurdles that prevent many girls and women to access the internet. The somewhat good news is that if we look at the data, at least the latest data that we had available when we drafted the report as well, you can see that that divide is slowly shrinking. So I think now it is at around 12%. And that was a decline of 2% from the year prior. So that is in itself a development in the right direction if that continues. Also, again, on the region not being a monolith, we also know that women are in some countries using the internet more than men. Again, that is mostly in the GCC region. But nevertheless, something that is important to acknowledge. Also beyond the GCC, in countries like Sudan and Palestine, the gap is around 5%, so smaller than the regional average. And I think it's important to highlight that when we think about these divides and problems, that this is not just an issue of inequality that we should solve for moral reasons, but also one that has big economic consequences. When we think about people being able to participate in the digital economy, and I think we'll hear about the digital economy later on a bit more. I remember one study that was looking at 32 countries and the digital gender divide on a global level that estimated that in 2020 alone, the total GDP loss that came from this digital gender divide was for these countries $120 $26 billion. So we can also use that to think about the MENA region and what is being lost by not connecting more women and girls. So then briefly moving to the urban-rural divide, here the main point is that people in urban areas are much more likely to be able to use the internet than people in rural areas. So there is a big gap between the number of people. I think it's around 32% between urban and rural areas. And that is also reflected in the infrastructure. So if we look at what types of mobile internet are available in rural areas and what are available in urban areas, there's a big difference when we look at, for example, 4G coverage. So again, I think there's an imperative there to improve the infrastructure. And also, if we think about these numbers and these divides, as we highlight in the report, really this is about moving the conversation and policy action towards accessibility. It's not enough that we just improve internet coverage. I think over 90% of the region is already covered by at least a 3G mobile network. But we need to also factor in how affordable is the data, how affordable are the devices that people use to use the internet. Do people have the skills to use the internet for various tasks? And so all of that needs to be factored in, alongside also social norms that might prevent some people from using the internet. Just to wrap up, I wanted to stress on affordability. We have seen some improvements when it comes to the price of mobile data, but many countries in the region are still too expensive for poorer families to access the internet that way. And at the moment, according to the latest data, Yemen has been the least affordable country. But I believe we might hear about Yemen later on as well in a different angle. So I think I'll leave it at that, and happy to comment on any of these points later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. I'd also just contribute that the affordability that the ITU believes is ideal is about 2% of income. And I think we found that most countries, the average GDP per capita is too far below that. But you mentioned infrastructure as a key driver of the affordability and access picture. So I wanted to turn this over to Nermeen. I know that, and I should also mention that Nermeen also helped inform us on the research to this paper. But Nermeen, Manuel highlighted some of the key digital divides that are holding back the MENA region, both socially and in terms of internet access and infrastructure. So could you tell us a little bit more about how states are addressing this through regulation and investment?
Yes, thank you so much, Alex, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting panel today. Actually, what Manuel has mentioned is very much correct in the sense of there is a digital divide in the region, and it's not only among the countries within the region, it must be there as well within one country itself. I will focus maybe my talk for now on internet infrastructure, and I would like to just introduce very quickly the global framework that is agreed upon for the internet infrastructure, and that has three components. The first of which is called access infrastructure, and this is the entire value chain of the carrying the traffic from one point to the other, whether it is international traffic or domestic one. Followed by the second point will be the data center and internet exchange points, where traffic and content can be exchanged and hosted on local basis. And finally, the digital economy, and of course the MENA region is striving actually to transform their economies into a digital one. So this is the ecosystem that would create or allow the content to be there and the services to be available for the people. We have, when we speak about the infrastructure, we have to mention the COVID and the lockdown that took place in 2020 and how this has impacted hardly actually the MENA region, leaving governments and people like in a shock situation at one point in time, trying to stand up to be able to continue living and communicating with one another, or continue learning and so on. So as we move forward from the COVID back in 2020 and we look at it right now, we can see that there is kind of validation that the design and the resilience of the internet has been, like contained or preserved, yet the increased demand over the internet on the different scales and the different levels has also highlighted that there are some existing gaps in access infrastructure in specific, and this by itself lead to widening the digital divide, as I mentioned earlier, between and among the country itself. We are working currently at the Internet Society on a new report that would explain and reflect on the e-readiness of the region, exploring the internet infrastructure there, and we will be like testing the region against a few elements. The international internet bandwidth, for instance, the national backbones, last mile access technologies like 4G, 5G, DSL, fiber, and so on, in addition to, of course, submarine cables and fiber optics to the home and so on. We can see progressing in the MENA ahead of their income group. However, we can see as well countries such as Tunisia, for example, lagging on average in quality of the available infrastructure because of the situation there. The Economist Intelligence Unit and Index report has noted that Kuwait has scored the highest when it comes to availability and readiness due to the employment of the fiber optic networks to promote smart cities, which enhance in return the average fixed broadband download and upload speed. This will be followed by United Arab Emirates, which ranked number 4 in the MENA due to the development of the infrastructure, promoting average mobile broadband and upload speed. And luckily, Egypt has as well climbed 5 ranks from where it was before because of the investment that was poured in when it comes to ICT infrastructure and deployment of the fiber optics, improving internet speed from 6.5 megabytes to 34.8 megabytes. However, as we move forward and as we witness some development on the road, we can as well see some prevailing challenges that the region is facing, and that would, in my opinion at least, would need some kind of concentration or focus from the government to tackle together or one after the other, so that they can leapfrog as they would aspire to do. Among the challenges that we can mention here is the peering partner. So we are still face the fact that we are peering through Europe, for instance. So the ISPs in MENA has to pay for the transit to the IXP in Marseille, for instance, or any other IXP in Europe, like Linux, for instance, or something like this. We can see that there are some developed platforms similar to the Netflix in the Arab region, like Shahid, like Watchfit, like اليوم السابع, which is one of the leading newspaper, electronic, of course, now newspaper, and all of these platforms that are like the bread and butter for the citizens in the MENA are being hosted in United States or in Europe or whatever. This, of course, increases the cost for the users or the end user, and it might entail some security issues as well when it comes to data and information that moves all around. When it comes to the IXP, which is one of the beautiful, part or component of the internet infrastructure, still we lack having IXP across the MENA in a harmonized manner. We have about 11, if I recall well, IXP in MENA out of the 22 countries, the first of which were established in Egypt in 2002. United Arab Emirates has established its own in 2012. And then recently in 2019, we see Morocco having their first IXP, Jordan in 2020, and Palestine in 2020. And the Palestinian IXP was first established by the community with the help of the Internet Society, and then the government of Palestine as well establish another governmental IXP, if we call it as such. There is a limited level of competition when it comes to international gateway. So we still see actually the incumbent having or putting their hand on the international gateway, and the submarine cable market is not as open as it should be, and that could by itself provide a huge opportunity for the MENA region to develop their market and to develop or to be more attractive to content providers to host their data center in the region. When it comes to spectrum policy, still MENA countries have made less substantial spectrum availability, and that resulted in limiting network capacities. Yet, as we say that there is still a challenge in that, we can see that Saudi Arabia standing up as a good illustration of the rollout of the 5G spectrum within MENA, and it was the first country to allocate the mid-band spectrum for the 5G with the auctions of the 2.3 gigahertz and 3.5 gigahertz bands back in 2019. I don't know if you want me now to cover the accessibility issues among the rural and urban areas, or you would like me to stop here?
I think I want to come back to you on that point. I think that will be a good opportunity to hear more about that and also hear some of the experiences of the other panelists with that issue. But I wanted to grab one hot issue that you mentioned, is that the Middle East digital economy and investment is thriving. And I think one thing that I forgot to mention in the intro was that according to WAMDA, which is an organization that watches the Middle East startup scene, investment in 2021 was up almost 200%, went from around 1 billion to almost 3 billion in a year. And we're going to see the results of that in a few years. But I wanted to turn that over to Alice for a second. I think the interesting thing to note about that figure is that we are all, well, if you read the WAMDA 2021 year in review, it's quite clear a lot of that investment went to places like the UAE, even places like Jordan were pretty high up the list. And then that doesn't mean that tons of that money end up in places like Iraq. But one thing that's interesting is that there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity there. And by the sound of it, a lot of investor interest, especially because Iraq is a big market. So the question for you, Alice, is because Iraq is actually a case for a lot of these accessibility issues, big rural-urban divides, much bigger gender digital divides than in comparison to the Gulf. What has it been like to start an accelerator and watch these entrepreneurs grow in their roles in a country that has some challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And it's great to be here with you both, Manuel and Nermeen, as well. As mentioned, I am the co-founder and executive director of an organization called 51 Labs, which is a startup incubator based in Iraq that supports idea and later stage entrepreneurs from across Iraq and Syria. It has been amazing running 51 Labs for the past close to 5 years in Iraq, because I think over that time, we have really seen a blossoming of Iraq's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Alex, you mentioned, most of the money in the region is going to these places that I think anyone that knows anything about the Middle East has heard of Saudi Arabia's startup scene. They've heard of the amazing stuff happening in Egypt or Jordan. And my guess is, even if you are quite well versed on what's happening across the Middle East, you may not be aware of what's happening in Iraq, because it is really kind of just now coming into the forefront. And I would argue that it's one of the most exciting places to keep an eye on right now in the region. So when we started in 2017 in Iraq, we were the first full-time incubator in the whole country. We were one of the first actors. And because of that, we were really able to see the beginning of entrepreneurial interest. Since then, I think things have really changed for the better. So in almost every city across Iraq, you will find an incubator or an accelerator or a co-working space. This increase in support for digital entrepreneurs is obviously increasing digital entrepreneurship as well, because the cost of starting is lower. So, a recent IOM study in Soleimani province, for example, noted that 77% of youth in the region now see entrepreneurship as an exciting career path that they would be interested in taking. In a country where the oil sector has definitely been the largest and dominating sector, and where, the public sector jobs are definitely more popular than private sector jobs, I think it's a huge change that we're seeing this shift in interest among young people to entrepreneurship. But then beyond that, this growth in number of early stage firms, over time obviously means that there is a growth in the pipeline of investable startups as well. So starting in 2019, Lezu, which is a super app based out of Erbil, was the first Iraqi digital startup that was able to enter Y Combinator in the Silicon Valley, which is one of the best known kind of accelerators around the world. They then received an investment in 2019 of, I think, around $1 million, which at the time was groundbreaking for Iraq. This was the largest investment into a tech startup that we had seen. Fast forward to this year, January 2022, Rocket Internet, a number of months ago, launched their first super app in Iraq called Bali, and Bali received a record investment of 10.5 million. So you can see in just this very short period of time, 2019 to 2022, we're seeing this real kind of shift in the way that people are looking at tech startups in Iraq, which is incredible. And Bali obviously is a Rocket Internet startup, but there are a lot of local tech startups that are also receiving multiple rounds of funding, multi-million-dollar deals. And so more and more there is investor interest, both regional and locally. We have seen the first angel network launched in Baghdad. There are now 2 institutional VC funds focused fully on Iraq. And so more and more, I think this is becoming a really exciting place. Now, the question you might ask is why? I think the news from the headlines you might get about Iraq seem to paint it as, a high-risk location, lots of violence, security issues. Iraq has its ups and downs, like every country does, but I think more and more the opportunities are definitely outweighing the risks. So Iraq is a huge market. It's the 4th largest in the Middle East, 40 million people. Of that, according to Hootsuite data, the number of people with mobile phones is close to 98%. That data is based on number of mobile phones versus population, and many people do have multiple phones. So that might be slightly misleading, but it is a lot. And then, in terms of internet accessibility, I think it's at around 75%, which is more than the average of the region. And there's fairly good purchasing power. It's an oil state. People actually do have some money to spend on things. And the other thing to keep in mind is that Iraq historically has been a fairly traditional marketplace. So there are many kind of more traditional businesses, and also the economy has been dominated by the oil sector, which means that there is a lot of room for locally made products and for technological innovation. So more and more, and especially during COVID, you're seeing people come up with tech solutions to everyday problems, and customers, again, especially during COVID, are now shifting online to buy their goods, to order phones, to connect with service people who can fix things in their house. And so it's, in many ways, an open market with many business opportunities, and you're seeing more technological solutions filling those gaps. Now, Iraq is still one of the, I would say, most challenging places in the world to launch a business, at least according to the Doing Business report. And that's true for technology startups as well. Iraq does not, as of now, have a law regulating online-based businesses. So if you run an e-commerce site or an app, you cannot register as that business, you have to register a brick and mortar business and have your technology component as a project of the business. This can create a lot of challenges. It ends up being quite costly. And a lot of that comes down to the understanding on the government's part in terms of what innovative business models are and how technology can be used in these business ways. But I think what we're seeing is that things are moving in the right direction. So the government is already talking about how to reform those laws and how to change the business registration process. In the Kurdistan region of Iraq, over the past couple of years, they've had a services project where they've moved many of the government services online now. And they're starting to think about, how do we pay government employees over e-payments instead of in cash? And so I think more and more you are seeing this shift towards digitization, which will be really beneficial both for the economy and for efficiency of the government sector and kind of other areas of life. So I would say it's a really exciting time for this one country in the region. And I think this one country is really emblematic of what is happening across the whole region. And so I think we're going to see a lot of interesting things happening in the next couple of years.
Oh, thank you, Alice. I'm excited now. Definitely. Thank you for that really thorough overview. One thing as a administrative note, if you would like to submit a question, please send it to mep@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tweet @WilsonCenterMEP. And we're already having some questions coming in, so please, by all means, submit your questions. And wow, there's so many more questions I have for you guys. So I'm going to bounce around a little bit. Alice, you mentioned that there is interest and actual effort on behalf of the government to move services online. And the question I have is, one thing we looked at in our paper is some of these emergency measures that actually popped up during the pandemic that were actually meant to get people access, get people, lower income people access, and help facilitate schools, hospitals getting online. So I actually wanted to go back to Manuel for a second. I know that you looked at this issue, and I'm wondering what interventions really came about that had the best possibility for becoming permanent solutions to the access issue and actually bridging the divide a little bit more.
So yeah, as you mentioned, there was a variety of issues to keep, especially in the realm of education, because it was sort of an issue of school closures happening rapidly and many people having to try to learn from home. And we have unfortunately seen that in many countries that was a major challenge, and there are sort of estimates that school children lost at least half a year of learning during the pandemic, if not more. And some countries have only, I think actually Iraq is among them, have only fairly recently opened up again in terms of the schools. So in terms of the measures, I think the ones that will be most successful in the end, and I say will be because I do think we still need to see more on making these measures actual policies. So for example, when we talk about allowing internet websites to be 0 rated for educational content in various countries. So that is a very good step, because or at least it can be part of measures that help people to access education content, because as said earlier, many countries are not hitting that 2% UN broadband commission target. So if people have to spend money on their mobile data to access educational content, that is a big hurdle. And the same thing goes for access to devices. In Lebanon, for example, there was a study that showed that around half of the school population did not have permanent or stable access to devices to do so. So I think here we also have to think about the role of donors and what they can do to help fund access to devices, for example, or provide sort of logistical support in those areas, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you. And as a matter of fact, that gave me, especially with the comment around donors, I think that we did look at there is an important role for actors to play to fill critical gaps that aren't necessarily profitable from a business standpoint. And I think that's a good segue to what we were discussing with Nermeen in terms of extending the last mile infrastructure to those places that don't normally get the reach of the incumbent service providers. And I know that one thing that came up in our conversations with you, Nermeen, is community networks, and Internet Society is very active in that space. So maybe if you could talk a bit about the current projects to implement these on behalf of the Internet Society and others, and other means that maybe we're less aware of that governments, donors, other actors are using to get internet into the more households.
Yes, sure, Alex. Let me first start by setting the scene for the connectivity when it comes to broadband plans and satellite connectivity. So according to the ITU, Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Saudi Arabia have the highest satellite broadband subscriptions in the region. And we have seen that there is a boom in or improvement happening on that sense as well in Bahrain, Tunisia, Sudan, Morocco, and Oman. However, it has dropped substantially in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Algeria, and United Arab Emirates because those countries have started to deploy fiber optics rather than satellite services. The MENA region in general, if we may look at it when it comes to 5G adoption, still it's not famous in the region, if you can call it as such, remains leaving 4G as the main technology for mobile access. And some of the recent statistics that we got is that 47% of the MENA population is covered by broadband mobile. However, not all of them are subscribed to the mobile internet because of the various reasons. As Manuel has mentioned, affordability is one of those barriers for sure. And still we have 10% to 15% of the MENA population not covered by mobile broadband or any other connectivity. This is why at the Internet Society, we've started to think about innovative way of connectivity. And here comes the concept of community network. We are very much concerned about connecting the next billion. We believe that this is something that we should take on our shoulder as part of our mission. And the community network stands up as a good example to be well adopted in the region. It wasn't easy at the beginning when we started to talk about it. Government were a little bit suspicious about the concept, thinking that it might be a kind of backdoor to have access to data that it shouldn't be on public network, and that it has to be unregulated. And this is something that the region is still a little bit, again, skeptical when it comes to regulation and so on. However, recently in 2021, we were able to finalize an agreement actually with the first country to adopt and establish a community network, and that is Yemen. And the first community network will be established at Hadramaut there in Yemen by the community and in coordination with the ministry and the regulator there. It's a collaboration of effort actually with the technical community in certain area where we raise the capacities of the technicians and the expertise there to be able to empower them to be able to manage the community network once it's there. And we link it to we link the last mile with the, of course, main backbone within the country. I think this is a kind of solutions for connectivity that could solve many issues and problems when it comes to accessibility, not only in the MENA, but actually in other places of the world. We are very happy with the development that we are seeing happening in Hadramaut at Yemen. And we look forward, actually, there are some other discussion in the pipeline with other countries. I will not be able to mention the names now, but there are a couple of countries that we are discussing with them, establishing a community network there. I hope that we can see them up and running by the end of this year. And I think it will be very beneficial to the citizens in that specific areas as well.
Thanks, Nermeen. And before we move on from that, I'm kind of curious, you mentioned the government inhibitions to accepting the idea of community networks, and perhaps some of that is just natural skepticism to a new framework. But I'm wondering, and I won't make you divulge these other countries that you're in conversation with, but what has really been the fruitful approach to convincing, governments and regulators to be involved or acquiescent to some of the things that community networks need to thrive? For example, maybe allowing certain parts of spectrum or allowing the involvement of the incumbent ISP. If you could help us understand that a little bit more.
Sure. So the reason, as I mentioned, that government were a little bit skeptical about community network is that they thought that it's, as I mentioned, a backdoor to seek to get hand on the data. But actually, community network, we reintroduced it in the region in the right manner, meaning that a community cannot have a network of their own without having support from the government, the regulator in specific, as well as the incumbent or any mobile operator that could be working there and has the willingness to support and give, the access, because community network is already connecting this area in the neighborhood, for instance, with the backbone. So we have to take the backbone from the operator, whether it is an incumbent or mobile operator or whatever. And for the incumbent or the mobile operator to do this, they have to go back to the regulator to get the permission to do this. The only thing that we explained that instead of imposing, strict kind or layers of regulation on that project, for instance, we lighten it up. We explained how to lighten it up so that they can be able to have a connectivity model as simple as the community network can be. The other thing is that while we are doing or deploying the community or the network, we raise the capacities, as I mentioned, and the skills that is available in that specific region. So the students or even people who can have some interest in understanding how to manage the network, we work with them. We put in place a very good capacity building program for the community there so that we can have a sustainable network. So it's not like a network that we will build and let it fall down after a year time. It could be a lifetime network that can serve this area, and they can depend on it when it comes to hospitals, when it comes to universities, schools, and so on and so forth. So government are starting to think in a different way, if I may call as such, when it comes to community network, having more trust.
That's good news. And apparently so, being that you are starting the conversation with more governments, and I hope those go through effectively. And now to go back to Alice for a second, before I shoot you a question, I just wanted to corroborate something you said earlier, that more people are interested in entrepreneurship. Also, according to the Arab Youth Survey, this is true for the whole region. More people are now considering entrepreneurship as a viable career path than they have the previous year. But my question for you, I have a couple, but I start this way. You mentioned some of the exciting news, but also some of the challenges, especially with recognizing what a digital business is for the government. But also, I'm still sticking to the access issue. If you develop a new app or you develop a new digital service in the UAE, your decisions and your customers are going to look very different. So what is it like being a digital entrepreneur where people don't frequently have access to high-speed internet or maybe just occasional access? What kind of innovations are people able to develop to really reflect the reality of that market?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I will try to give you a good answer. We'll see how I do. One interesting thing about Iraq is that the types of businesses I think definitely are fitting Iraq's challenges. So an example of this is I have come across a lot of last mile delivery services, which basically allow, in a country where Google Maps works only partially, even in urban areas and where there isn't really an address system, you see a lot of solutions that are meant to solve a lot of these more rural problems. Agritech, again, is something that is becoming really interesting. And a lot of the e-commerce sites are focusing on, if you don't have access to local markets near you, how can we connect you with products that are coming in from internationally? So that is kind of an answer to how are local startups supporting with rural areas, but not about the access issue. And I think when it comes to the access issue, it's interesting because I think one trend we see in Iraq, and my guess is it is across the whole region, is that a lot of businesses are actually based on social media or over WhatsApp much more than on websites, and more than on apps as well. So I would say, there are a lot of businesses that we've seen that they may have a website to describe what their business is, but when it really comes down to it, all of their interactions take place over WhatsApp or phone calls. Even now, still, more people are moving towards using apps where everything happens on the app. But I think just in response to the types of customers they have, there's also definitely a push towards understanding that you're probably going to be talking to your customer on the phone. Your customer is almost definitely going to be paying in cash and not in some sort of mobile payment. Often it does happen through Instagram. So you have an Instagram page where you're direct messaging people, and that is just more accessible, I think, to a lot of people, especially because, as mentioned earlier, most people aren't using computers. If they have access to the internet, it is on their phone. And when it's on their phone, mostly it's through the social media apps. People may not even know how to Google the types of businesses they want. But when it comes to finding a great business on Instagram, people know how to do that and do it really well. So one of the things that we have been working with is trying to find these kind of Instagram or messaging-based businesses and supporting them to professionalize so that they can expand across either the region that they're in or across the country, which in itself is quite challenging because of the regulatory environment in Iraq. And because, customers in different places obviously are using different methods of communication. But I would say, just to answer your question, that is probably the main thing we have seen. And I think, there have been times because of protests or other reasons where the government has actually shut down all internet in different locations for extended periods of time, not necessarily all hours of the day, but long enough that, we've had online-based businesses that have really struggled. But because they are used to the situations that you've kind of discussed, I think all of them do have alternative ways of conducting their business. And so even, I think October 2019, when there were kind of protests across the country, you saw tech businesses reacting really quickly to be able to operate even in a situation where there might not have been internet at all in their city.
Well, that's a fascinating picture. So, because more people are only on phones, I think that's a really important point to underscore. I mean, it's hard for me to think of a world where I can't look up a website or something, or even make an order online. So having that based on social media and having businesses understand the environment they're working in, so they do have ways to access those people, even when internet just disappears for an arbitrary reason, like a shutdown. The second question I had for you, just really briefly, so when you look at the pipeline of things coming through, and you look at the volume of money going to the hotter startup scenes, but those are also bigger scenes for investors as well. I'm wondering how those leading markets are now looking at Iraq as maybe an opportunity
Yeah, we are seeing, I would say, especially in the last 1 to 2 years, a lot of regional startups interested in entering the Iraq market. And so we've had Kareem, for example, and, a couple of other of the major regional startups entering, especially into Baghdad. I think it's an interesting situation, and I think it's actually positive for Iraqi startups in that the regulatory environment is challenging enough that there is a pretty high barrier to entry when it comes to regional startups trying to access the Iraqi market. You have to re-register your business in every city you expand to. Mostly lack of mobile or e-payments means that a lot of things happen in cash. If you don't have kind of the logistical know-how to be able to manage a business in that context, then I think it's pretty challenging. So, Kareem for a while was trying to do food delivery, for example, and then they actually pulled that back because they realized that there were other businesses like Al Saria, which is an Iraqi startup that knew how to do it in Iraq's context and could do it much better. So there are some situations where we see regional startups that are really gaining popularity, and then in others, I think you see the Iraqi incumbents winning out, at least for now.
Great. Yeah, well, fascinating that, a company can come in, try to do something and can't do it better than a local one because they just know how to work there. So I'm going to move to some of our audience Q&A. We have a lot of great questions coming in. Just as a final prompt, you can email questions to mep@wilsoncenter.org or tweet it at wilsoncentermep. But I'm going to be Selfa for just a minute and pitch a question I'd like to hear from most of you, because this is something that we've tried to highlight and we haven't touched on yet in this conversation. What has the role, barrier or support behind education and skills in this picture? It matters a lot for things like Nermeen says, capacity building for community networks or developing infrastructure. It matters for entrepreneurs. It matters for hiring. So maybe if I could start with Manuel for a second. I know that we looked at this issue in some detail. If you could summarize some of the findings there and whatever your other thoughts are and how this may be both a barrier in one way, but also an important area of development that can be a catalyst for spurring that growth.
Yeah, absolutely. So to start with the barrier, I think alongside affordability, digital skills are still one of the main barriers for people, whether they're able to use the internet or not. And so that means there needs to be more sort of targeted education to make sure that everyone knows at least basic ICT skills, how to use email, a website. We talked about Googling a website earlier. So all these things. And that remains, unfortunately, the case that not everyone is able to do that. And one thing that we also highlighted in the report is that in general, there is a larger problem when it comes to the, let's say, education pipelines for ICT skills. There is, of course, a big burden remains on public education systems that had to also shoulder the burden that came with COVID-19. But also another point that's important is that the private sector can, and as we recommend, should do more to invest in skilling their employees, but also recent graduates that might not have the right skills to enter private sector jobs right away, but have a basic or even a not advanced theoretical knowledge as well. And maybe briefly on connecting it to the economy again, another point that's important is that on the one hand, in the digital economy, of course, it is very important to have ICT skills. So we need people that are able to program and so on. But at the same time, what we've heard as well is that what is often lacking beyond that is actually management skills or English language skills that are necessary to navigate when you build a team, when you try to expand into a new market. And so there needs to be not just a focus on getting people the latest ICT skills, but also these other, I mean, maybe we can call them soft skills in some form, that are needed to be successful in the digital economy. I think I'll leave it at that. I'm curious to hear what the others have to say.
Thank you, Manuel. Nermeen, Alice, do either of you have a thought on that from your unique standpoints? Nermeen, go ahead.
Yes, if I may, if I but just want to put the term future jobs. If you remember, we have started to hear about future jobs just before the COVID emerged in our lives, and then the COVID happened, and everything turned to be an online on the online platforms in general, whether it's education or school or universities or even telemedicine and so on. And for MENA, this was and has been very new. Even on a family level, elder people wanted to speak to their children and grandchildren, and they didn't know how to use Zoom, for instance, or how to send an email or whatever. So capacity building for the MENA, I think, is a key component for the development of the region. Whether it will be, like Manuel has mentioned, soft skill level of kind of training that anyone could take, or a more sophisticated training program that can raise the capacities when it comes to ICT and internet related. We have put in place an online program. We call it TEL, and our e-learning at Internet Society, that is free of charge. It's open for everyone, and it reflects on how the internet is being constructed and how it could be managed, and the development that we can see when it comes to security, encryption, routing security, and so on and so forth. It's very, very important, and we try all the time to partner with institutions and universities to be able to reach to more students, whether they are still maybe in their senior years at universities or just graduated and would like to acquire some new skills so that they can be able to compete in the market. The international market nowadays necessitates a person to have some skills that in the MENA, unfortunately, the kind of curriculum that we have is still outdated in some areas or in some places. And I think it would be better that we take, as international organizations and research institutions, the burden out of the shoulder of the government and provide these kind of capacity building programs to help out the communities and the people to be able to compete internationally and even locally.
Oh, that's a great comment. I mean, I think that digital skill support for all levels is really important. It's becoming very clear. Alice, last but not least, is there an interesting skills take for entrepreneurs, whether the skills they need or the skills they need to hire to grow?
Yeah. And I think Nermeen made a lot of great points that really are the same in Iraq. I think universities are not providing the skills necessary for someone to be able to run a business or work in a more modern capacity in a business. And I think a lot of it, I mean, first of all, because business is not a very attractive thing to study. I think in the Middle East, there's still a focus on medicine and engineering and these things, even if what you want to do later is to go into business. And then secondly, I think there's a huge focus on theory over practice. But the good thing, at least in Iraq, and I've seen this elsewhere in the region as well, is that I think everyone now understands this. And so more and more actors are pushing for these skills development. So in Iraq, you see all three of the major telcos, Zain, Korek, Asiacell, are all running some sort of program to help young people gain kind of technical skills. The major donors all have kind of ICT focused programs that are, we have coding boot camps like Recoded. We have maker spaces where people are learning about 3D printing and IoT. And then there's also this focus on business, which you mentioned. It's really important to have those management skills. So something that just launched, I think, last year is called Baghdad Business School, and it's a year-long post-undergraduate program where basically it's supposed to be kind of okay, you've done university, now let's get you ready for the real world and for real jobs. So it's a combination of English and management. So I think the good thing is everybody realizes that this is a problem and is trying to fix it in a variety of ways.
That's great. And I appreciate the shout out to Baghdad Business School, who we also talked to when we were surveying voices in the region, and this was one of their concerns. And so I think this would be a perfect opportunity. We have another 25 minutes, and we have quite a stack of questions to get through. And so first and foremost, we have kind of a Yemen combo here. It's just interesting. We just did a Yemen event earlier this week. So the first part of that combo is, what are the best solutions to Yemen's limited and vulnerable internet capacity, especially with the recent targeting of the infrastructure and the conflict? I welcome anybody to have remarks on that, but because we mentioned Yemen earlier, Nermeen, do you have any thoughts on that? Nermeen, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, when it comes to political conflict in general, I think even at the UN level, it's becoming more and more a kind of human right thing that the internet infrastructure should be out of the conflict zone and shouldn't be hit. Yemen is already suffering from having one access to the backbone, the international backbone, through one fiber. So if this fiber has any kind of cut or attack or whatever, then the internet would be shutting down at Yemen. And this actually took place with the last bombing and political imbalance that was there. We work closely with the Yemen chapter there. They are very, very active to find solutions for a matter of redundancy. So instead of having just this one fiber that feeds them from the international bandwidths, they can have another, maybe a cable or maybe satellite connectivity or whatever, so that they can always have a kind of redundancy plan to maintain connectivity and to keep the internet up and running at Yemen. There are a lot being done in Yemen. I would assume that maybe in a couple of years we can see and we can say that similar to what Alice is mentioning about Iraq, another promising market would be popping up. Once the situation at Yemen settles down a little bit, there will be huge opportunities for investment on the layer of the infrastructure of the internet. And this is why we are very happy to start with the community network there in Hadramaut as a pilot. And if we are successful there by the end of this year, it will be rolled out in other areas as well, so that we maintain connectivity as much as we can until major infrastructure projects can be implemented.
Right. I mean, interesting what you said about redundancy plan. That could be a big deal in places like Yemen, and just to underscore the point that treating the internet more like a human rights issue, just like water or anything. It's just that important in today's world. So the second prong actually has to do with 5-1 Labs. There's curiosity, given its success in Iraq and Syria, about applying that model in Yemen. Alice, do you have any thoughts about how that might work?
Yeah, thank you, whoever gave that comment. We really appreciate you thinking of us. I think entrepreneurship in general is necessary in all of these places, because it is by empowering the local innovators who know the local challenges and can create, technological or scalable solutions to those problems. Like that is the way that I think a lot of this is going to play out in the Middle East over the next 5 years. So yes, I think there is definitely a place in locations like Yemen or Libya, where I am guessing there are many entrepreneurs already operating there and already kind of creating solutions. But often the challenge is that they don't have kind of holistic support to be able to do it, and the support to maybe get around challenging regulatory environments, risk environments, security environments. So we've definitely thought of those locations. We're actually starting to expand globally this year, and we will keep you all updated.
like and subscribe. Look at follow what they're doing. And maybe Yemen is another place they can go. But it is interesting that you're piloting a model that is supposed to be effective in places that have different kinds of struggles. So there's a Yemen segment, and now a quick question, and the question is, what other barriers to accessing the internet exist in rural areas other than lack of infrastructure? And Manuel, I'd like you to take a stab at this one.
Yeah, so I think overall, and this very much applies to rural areas. So we see issues with affordability, which is also gendered. Again, often women's disposable income is smaller, but we also need to come back to the question of skills. So it's not just that if people can afford a device even and mobile data, that they sort of have the necessary skills, as we said, and that can depend on the local context. Last but not least, also societal norms when it comes to, for example, in families, who will have access to the family computer or the mobile phone if there's not enough money for everyone to be able to afford one. So I think those are some of the hurdles that still need to be tackled. And again, this is not just for rural areas, but unfortunately happens also in urban context. Also the issue of cyber violence, which is often gendered. So these points sort of need to be tackled to make it more inclusive for people to access the internet in rural areas, but the last one certainly also across the country.
Right, I think that's important to highlight. Thank you for highlighting digital violence. That's also a barrier, prevents a lot of women from accessing internet, and digital literacy overall. I mean, it's probably easy to imagine it's not easy to have a computer introduction course in a rural school. So resources are very important for that as well. Were there any other thoughts on that? Or I can move on to the next question. Nermeen, I saw your hand go up earlier, so.
Yes, I would just add to what Manuel mentioned, local content in Arabic language. So whether even in rural areas or at some point in urban areas, I think the development of local content in Arabic is key for getting more people connected online. Actually, this is why I took it on my shoulder as a part of my responsibility at the Internet Society to translate even part of the e-learning programs that we have put in place, though it was very difficult because these are very technical, and usually technical terms, remains English. However, at least the context and how you develop the course itself could be in Arabic, so that we can encourage more people to get enrolled and start to learn skills that they might not have or get the opportunity to have fully in English. So local content is one of the concerns that we might be facing in the region when it comes to connectivity as well, beside affordability, of course. Thank you.
And I'll just add an illustration that when Nermeen said local content, I saw everyone's heads go up and down. There's a lot of agreement on that. And I was looking at some statistics that English and French, even in Arabic speaking countries, is by far still the dominant language of accessing internet sites. And then even among that, there's a lot of translation as well, which is inferior in a lot of ways to actually locally develop stuff. And then Alice, we have over to you if you want to take part of that.
Yeah, just adding off of that, a really quick comment is so much about the internet is biased towards English. And that goes towards digital skills as well. If you're learning coding, I mean, so much of it, you have to be able to know certain English words or be able to write in English. And that is a real challenge and should not be the way things are run. And I think especially when you're using a different script like Arabic, or I mean, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, there's even less available in Kurdish. And so I do think you get so many people that have no opportunity to access the benefits of the internet because of language barriers, which is really upsetting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for further illustrating that and bringing up a diversity component too, that there are other language groups, even within countries that having content available. And I think that adds a lot to that rural picture, that people in rural areas are much less likely to have the diversity of language skills that they need to access the wider internet. So they need content that's sensitive to their needs as well. So here's another infrastructure related question. Nermeen, I think this might be a good one for you, but I also welcome any other thoughts among the group. The question is, are there cross-border projects being pursued by governments in the region? And perhaps a few areas to tackle there would be agreements to build fiber or integrate data centers, IXPs, for example, but others, if you happen to know.
There has been and still a serious conversation among the Arab countries to have regional IXP so that we can keep the traffic in the region instead of, peering, as I mentioned earlier, outside from Europe or from the US. We don't see it still up and running, but there is a level of conversation on the highest level about establishing regional IXP, and not only one, even they are thinking about maybe 3 IXPs so that we can connect, they can connect the countries within. The other project that could be put in place, still there are some discussion to have a submarine cable, because the Arab Peninsula in general is like it floats on a seabed of cables, whether they pass through Egypt or those are beside Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and so on. So if there is a kind of project that can connect all these together and then connect this cable with the one in Italy and another one in India and so on, then I think the Arab region could be a regional, actually a global hub for data traffic. And this by itself would be very much of attraction to CDNs and data centers to have their caches in the region instead of having it outside the region. So yes, there are opportunities when it comes to infrastructure as we move forward. Yes, thank you.
And I have a hand up from Manuel to add to that.
I just wanted to add on the cables. One study that might be of interest to people that we cite in the report that actually focuses on sub-Saharan Africa and the impact of the arrival of submarine cables and so high-speed internet on what type of jobs are being created. And so I think there might be some lessons in there also for the MENA region. So just pointing that out.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, Manuel. And by the way, the report is linked below the browser where you're probably watching this now. So if you would like to read more, it's just a click away. But before we move on from that, I'm kind of curious, are there any regional governments that are trying to lead this vision of maybe MENA being a digital hub connecting India, Europe, places like that?
Can I answer this?
Yeah, go ahead, Nermeen.
Actually, several countries in the region are trying to take the lead, either transforming their own country into a hub, like Kuwait, for instance, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, for example, and lately, actually, we can see as well Saudi Arabia trying to transform part of their kingdom and with this, NEOM and the new cities that they are establishing to have them as well a hub, not only for tourism and culture, but as well for data centers and technology hub in the full sense of the word. Yet, when they discuss this kind of projects, as I mentioned, like the regional IXP or the submarine cable that can connect the whole region with the whole globe, I think this takes place at the Arab League, where they have a ministerial council for ICTs, and these are the kind of meetings that can discuss strategic projects that is related to the region at large. I don't know if that replies to your question, but
Oh, it does. I think that a lot of countries are trying to distinguish themselves in this area, but the wider question of the regional collaboration required to achieve that in a substantive sense is interesting. And yeah, that would require cooperation of a lot of countries. And then another question we have, this one goes to you, Alice. You mentioned there's a significant desire to do business online in Iraq. What are some things that Iraq's government can do to make it easier and more attractive to do business there?
There are a number of things, and I think the good news is that the government is already working on some of them. The bad news is there's still a lot of things. So first and foremost is what I mentioned earlier with the registration. In order to register your business, it's a long and extremely complicated process for any type of business. That includes multiple signatures you need to get from multiple people, and every step along the way, there's a human component. So one thing that we have seen is if you are launching an innovative business with a new type of business model, it's really challenging to explain that to all of these different types of people in all of these different ministries and Chamber of Commerce, which could make it, which could mean that somewhere along the way you get stopped. An example of this is a number of years ago, we had a really incredible green roofing business actually go through our incubator. It was not really a tech business, but it was innovative. During the registration process, she had to go get ministry approval to launch her business, which is one of the steps. And the Chamber of Commerce told her, you are a construction business, so you have to go to the Ministry of Construction. And she went to the Ministry of Construction and they said, what is this green roofing? This is clearly agriculture. You need the Ministry of Agriculture to support you. And neither ministry would provide her the support because neither of them understood her business model. And she couldn't register her business at all. I mean, that was where it stopped. And this has happened in a number of cases. When you have, let's say, an online marketplace that connects babysitters to families. Is this a daycare? No, it's not really. It's connecting different people. What sorts of regulations does this type of business need to follow? And there are so many questions that, as of now, are not being answered. I could go on, but I think just one last thing I would mention is also in terms of the registration, maybe I'll mention two more things. One is in each city you expand to, you have to re-register your business. So if you're registered in Baghdad, you have to re-register if you're expanding to Erbil or vice versa. And these processes are extremely complicated, and often there are biases against people coming in from other cities, which means even if you have a technology that is highly scalable, you may not be allowed to scale across the provinces. And so that is one area that Iraq could definitely improve, and it would make a huge difference. And then finally, I would say there are still a lot of barriers around mobile and e-payments, both in and out of Iraq. So let's say you want to hire a developer from India. It's really challenging to pay that developer, or let's say you're a developer in Iraq. It's really challenging for you to get paid. PayPal does not operate in Iraq. There are a number of other services that don't operate. And then inside the country, this is starting to open, but the regulations around mobile money were pretty challenging in the past. So only in the past year or so has it been easier to pay for things online, which of course, if everything is happening in cash, it's hard to have a truly scalable business. And it also adds so much risk because you are literally, I remember Miswag, which was a grocery delivery business. At the beginning, they literally were driving truckloads of cash around the country to bring all their cash to one location. So there are a number of challenges. These are things that I think the government is aware of, but it makes it hard to launch a scalable and successful business.
Yeah, that's quite a list, and I know that things such as digital payment regulations are at the top of the agenda for entrepreneurs, but still stuck in a lot of places that have a lot of potential, like Lebanon, for example. But I just want to follow up on one thing that sounds unique to me. This localization of business registration and authorization. It sounds like there's probably a lot of intractable politics around that, but is there any kind of carve out that the entrepreneurship space is proposing to get around that issue, especially for digital businesses?
Digital entrepreneurs are extremely innovative, and I think any entrepreneur in Iraq is really gritty, really, really creative. And so businesses have definitely been able to thrive even despite these challenges. One way is because there is no law regulating online-based businesses, it is not actually illegal to run an online-based business that is not registered. It is worse for you because you don't have legal protections. It is worse for the government because the government doesn't get taxes. And so it is in everyone's interest to find a way around this, but that is one thing we have seen. Another thing is the government in Kurdistan is actually trying to change the rules so that if you register in one city, it is accepted. Many of the challenges come down to local chambers of commerce and wanting to maintain some of the control over the businesses in their cities. And so it's kind of in the middle of negotiations now. The challenges between Erbil and Baghdad are challenges that will probably take a while to solve. But what I would say is online-based businesses are gaining enough recognition, and there are enough regional investors now starting to invest in these businesses that I think they actually have a bit more power in these negotiations than they did, say, 3 years ago, and that has been very helpful for all businesses across the country to be able to handle some of these challenges.
Yeah, thank you for that. And when the regional investors get involved there, it changes the conversation, especially since Iraq is very interested in attracting a lot of that activity. So here's a more general question. I think that we should go around the room, and we have time for this last one before we take a closing statement. And this one's from our director, Marissa. What is one key policy that you would recommend to increase accessibility or readiness to go online? Might give that a minute, but.
Do you like me to start?
Absolutely.
I will always stress on regulation. I think government has to reconsider part of the regulatory framework that is prevailing from two perspectives. One, to update the telecom laws to reflect the kind of development that we are seeing in the market when it comes to connectivity and internet and even social media platforms and so on and so forth. That is from one side, and from the other side to start considering part of loosening up the strict regulation, especially at areas where we need as a region foreign direct investment so that we can develop the internet-related infrastructure so that we are able as a region to leapfrog and match the technology development that is prevailing maybe elsewhere. Despite all the effort that is being done by the governments, there are still windows for more to be done. But the regulatory frameworks in general need to be relooked or revised to match the new norm and to be able to be more attractive for foreign direct investment, in my opinion. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Nermeen. Thanks for bringing up the regulatory issue. Definitely needs to be addressed. Manuel, it sounds like you're ready.
Yeah, I would add to that. Maybe that's more a set of reforms, but I think it's important to reform the way digital skills are being taught, and we talked about some of the barriers earlier. And so again, I think that involves, of course, in the public education setting, but also the involvement of other players like civil society organizations and the private sector when it comes to reskilling, upskilling, and also importantly, not just at the university level, but also in vocational training. So yeah.
Yeah, and important again to highlight the vocational training part. That's always a vulnerability in Middle East countries. Alice, do you have something to add to that onto the wish list?
Yeah, I think I am of a similar mind of Manuel. I think education is really important, and I would actually even add earlier than higher education, thinking about how technology can be used in elementary and secondary education to increase people's skills and knowledge of how to use online resources. I think that if young people are coming up in the world, understanding the opportunities that are available to them using the internet, then I think there will just be more pressure for change as well, and that will really kind of push a lot of this forward. So I would say starting with education is a great way to do it.
And that is something, a point I'd love to end on. It is so important. And so, folks, we've heard a lot of great things. It's been a great conversation so far. We heard a lot about the digital divide and the potential erosion of it. We talked about thriving, if not complicated, startup ecosystem in Iraq. We talked about extending internet to some of the most remotely accessible people in Yemen. This has been a great conversation. So in closing, if that thought you just offered wasn't final enough, why don't we go around and give some final thoughts and maybe how you want people to see the digital economy and the digital transformation in the MENA region in 2022, 2023. What's your outlook? Alice, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I am an optimist, but I'm also an optimist because I have seen what has happened over the past 5 years. And what I would say is that this is a really exciting time for the whole region. I think the internet is building a breed of new companies, which is building a breed of new services that can really kind of expand and make more efficient the way that people are able to access different things across the whole region. And so I think the one thing I would say is we just need to find ways to support these innovators. And then they will, in many ways, they will do the rest. I mean, digital entrepreneurs are filling a lot of gaps that in other places governments are filling. I mean, there are amazing ed tech and health tech companies that are providing really important services to local populations. So I would say our role as kind of supporters of the region is to find out, first of all, how to get out of the innovators' ways, and then secondly, how do we provide them the platform and wraparound support they need to be successful. So I think it's a really exciting time for the region, and it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Thanks, Alice. Manuel, Nermeen?
Yeah, I'm happy to follow that. So I'd like to make 2 points at the end. So one would be that if we think about the economic side and the infrastructure side of the internet, we also, and that would be a topic for another panel, we also shouldn't forget that we need to make sure that the internet remains a place for open exchange without censorship, and that digital tools are unfortunately being used also for surveillance purposes in the region and beyond, as we've heard about it last year more so than ever. And on what we've been mainly discussing today, I think there is a lot of opportunity that comes with the digital transformation to build this new momentum in the private sector as well, to create new jobs and also new types of jobs that are highly skilled and that maybe even not on a mass scale, but can bring people back that might have the feeling they needed to go abroad and contribute to the economies back home. However, what we need to do to enable that, or what governments need to do, is to try to tackle these digital divides. Otherwise, we're just creating new inequalities, new layers of inequality, which unfortunately has already started to happen. So, yeah.
Thank you, Manuel. Nermeen, the last word is yours.
Thank you so much. I would just add to what my colleagues have mentioned. I do believe that MENA region at this point in time has a huge opportunity that actually was provided by the COVID and the lockdown, because this pushed the government to think in a different way, so that they can transform their business and the way they are living to the online. When they started to do this, they started to explore again in another way the potential that the internet could provide them. And I believe that more integration among the region and the government would allow better performance for the region at large, because there are scattered kind of talent and skills all over the MENA, and they just need to do some effort to, like aggregate them and explore what is there so that they can benefit their countries and their citizens from within. Thank you.
Perfect note to end on, Nermeen. So that's been our broadcast for today. Thank you everybody for tuning into your web pages today. Thank you to this distinguished panel. This was amazing. I really appreciated having you on. If you want to see more content from the Middle East program on digital transformation, workforce, and many other topics, please sign up for our email, like our social media pages, and come back and visit us soon. Thank you.